Okay, I think it's time to get started. I want to thank everyone for attending this session and skipping Kobe Bryant to come to the discussion on Africa, understanding its unique value proposition. We have such an outstanding lineup of speakers. You have read their bios. You do not want to hear me go on a monologue for 10 minutes. So what I'm going to quickly do is I'm going to introduce everyone, tell you where they're sitting, and then we're going to basically go right into the questions. And also we're going to make this interactive. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So to my left, we have Yvonne Ike, Managing Director and Head of Sub-Saharan Africa for Bank of America, Merrill Lynch. To my right, we have Bassem Haidar, co-founder and CEO of GMT Group and chairman and CEO of IT Group. Next to Yvonne, we have Jay Ireland, president and CEO of GE Africa. And then next to Bassem, we have Samit Gelat, managing director of KG, one of East Africa's largest civil engineering companies, and a new addition to the panel, and we thank you so much for joining us. So my first question is basically the big, broad one. Really the why Africa question. And I think about, I started at the CIA as an analyst in 2001, and sentiment was really still sort of stuck in the place of the Economist magazine cover of 2000, the hopeless continent. And then we switch over to the Africa Rising story that we see on the May 2013 Economist cover. So the question I always have for people now is, where does Africa sit between the hopeless continent and the euphoric Africa Rising story? Yvonne, give this one to you.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. Africa is still rising. The dynamic has changed very much. So the fundamentals of, and I'll say this very quickly because everyone's heard it before, about the large population, the big marketplace, the middle class is rising. However, the difference here is that the emerging middle class is changing in the nature of its rise and the rate at which it's growing. And what this means is only the people who really understand how the economies work and provide solutions that are relevant for the economy will benefit from that rise.
Jay?
Well, I think it's in the middle, but it's in the middle because you've got 54 countries, and some of them are hopeless, and some of them are rising. And I think when you look at Africa as an investment destination, or if you're going to do business there or whatever, you've got to pick the countries that you think you can succeed in. So I think that's the key thing, and people always lump it all together. It's like, nobody talks about Latin America that way, but they do talk about Africa that way. So what happens is a negative story in a relatively small country resonates across the whole continent. So, we've seen it with the Ebola thing, with, terrorism, all that stuff. And so it's just, you've got to pick your places where you're going to invest. You got to work at it, and then you're going to, and there are other places for a company like ours that we're not going to. And so we've picked, we're probably in 10 to 12 that we've got investments in and stuff. We sell to about 30, but there's 20 or so that we don't at this point. We will over time as things grow.
Simon?
Africa is, for us, a very interesting landscape. I think it's important to educate yourself on the diversity of the continent. You've got almost, on average, about 1,500 native languages on the continent. Kenya itself has 70, approximately. So it's a very diverse continent. And I think the potential in the continent is actually the problems that we face. The challenges that you see every day create the opportunities. And a lot of our businesses have actually started by looking at these problems and challenges.
And final thoughts on where does it sit?
My story is a bit different because I actually was born in the real star of Africa, which is Nigeria. So, but I've seen over the years, the rise of Nigeria was just incredible, but purely dependent on oil, and all the other economies were just, all the other scales in industries, manufacturing, everything was completely disregarded. And what has happened is you've had, out of need, very small countries, Rwanda, or Ethiopia, which is basically doesn't have any forex, but because of the right policies has been shining and growing at 8% per annum. So the balance is actually tilting. The Nigerian star, unfortunately, has been dimming for the last 18 months, which kind of really hurts a lot of people. But I was talking to some friends yesterday, and I think we all agree that this is a good thing for Nigeria, because it's about time where the pain is felt, and only when you feel pain you try and find a cure. It's not when you're doing very well that you try and take medication. So, and I think this is where we are. So there are a lot of rising stars, and it's definitely, we all know it's a place to watch. I mean, where else can you really go today for business?
Well, I wanted to take up just the point Samit was making about Africa being diverse. It is diverse. There are 54 countries, but in reality, as Jay was saying, there's really about 10 economies that, if you're looking to, if you're looking from a foreign perspective into the country, are really worth taking the time to invest. So it's diverse, but it's manageable, and very importantly, it depends on what you're looking for. Because if, for example, if you're looking for economies that are growing, they're more resilient, they do understand what it means to deliver policy, to take a long-term view, and to actually have a policy in the first place, then now the rising stars are more Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, and not necessarily Nigeria and South Africa, who always will be stars of Africa, but are not necessarily rising at this particular time. Will they rise in the long term? Absolutely. So it really depends on, and if you're looking, it depends on what you're looking for and the type of business you have that you want to do. And so that not generalizing in Africa is very important.
I think the other piece of it, which is getting better and better, is the regionalization. So, you know, you've got ECOWAS in the west, you've got East Africa Community and SADC in the east, and SADC in the south. And those are becoming much better organizations driving regional integration, which helps. I mean, there's no way that we're going to put 54 GEs into the continent, but we will do a number and then hopefully use some of the regional integration, which will help drive business in that arena. So if you look at East Africa, if you look at Kenya, where I'm located, you know, we got 40 million people, but if you look at East Africa, inclusive of Ethiopia, you got 250 million people. So and if you're able to use, and there's a lot of integration that's moving on. West Africa, obviously, is another one. Nigeria is the big one there, but then you look at the Francophone countries with Cote d'Ivoire that's kind of leading that. So there's a lot of different ways to look at it and really take advantage of it.
Can we drill down a little bit? Because one of the themes I've already sort of picked up on is the sort of differences between which countries you can classify as a success stories. We talked about the Rwandas, the Ethiopias. I mean, Cote d'Ivoire is amazing because I remember covering Cote d'Ivoire at the CIA when there was a horrible civil war going on in Cote d'Ivoire. So what is a success story behind? Is it because they're smaller? Like, where's the role of governance in producing these stars? And then, you know, by contrast, I mean, I also covered Nigeria, and I remember so much optimism over Obasanjo, and, you know, South Africa as well. And sort of, can Africa really thrive if you are having these challenges in two of the biggest economies there?
Well, look at it this way. I mean, if you're a South African manufacturer, on average, 27% of your goods go into Nigeria. So you focused on the 10 economies, if you like. But what happens is, you know, it's a domino effect. Nigeria falls, the whole countries around it. Benin lives off Nigeria because of car imports and a billion other things. So you have Nigeria that is kind of suffering at the moment. But my view of things is quite different. Okay, I was maybe lucky to start in Nigeria, the biggest one. It helped me a lot. And from there, we expanded to more than 20 countries. But I don't ignore the smaller countries which have huge opportunity. I mean, I've invested in Guinea-Bissau. I'm sure if I ask how many people know what Guinea-Bissau is here, not many would be able to point it out on a map. I've invested in Guinea-Bissau for the last 3 years in oil, big oil discovery and so on. So there are opportunities. It comes back again to really what are you looking for? If you're a GE, you're not going to go and invest $1 billion in Guinea-Bissau but because of scale. But if you're looking for bauxite production, Guinea-Bissau is a great place, for example. So we shouldn't ignore the other countries that still remain a secret today. And those are countries that have a lot of potential, but because they've been ignored, they're not in the media, not in the press, people don't know about them, and therefore there's no interest in these countries.
But again, like I just want to know, like, what when you talk about the smaller countries, like what have they done in terms of policies they've implemented, in terms of the regulatory environment? What was key for some of these countries? Again, like a Côte d'Ivoire, that you'd put them in this category. I mean, they've transitioned from a horrific, security situation to now being highlighted as one of the sort of success stories. What was key to making that transformation?
So I'll take Côte d'Ivoire and Rwanda, two pretty small countries, but very incredible stories. Côte d'Ivoire, we all remember 2010 was in war.
Yes.
What happened? Disruption happened on the political arena. Somebody who was well educated, and not just because he was educated abroad, but is just well educated, who said enough. I'm disrupting this story, this African story that has been told so many times before about political, lack of political brilliance, to put it in a different way. So enough already. I understand what it means. I know that my country needs foreign investment, so I'm going to engage. I'm going to have a policy, I'm going to have a strategy. I'm going to have an infrastructure plan. I'm going to have a plan to develop my agriculture, employment. I'm going to have an engagement and PR strategy with my stakeholders, including foreign investors, and I'm going to execute on the plan. So when you go to Côte d'Ivoire, 5 years ago, it was a disaster. You couldn't find decent hotels to stay in. You go today, you've got beautiful first-class hotels, Heineken, pastry shops like Paul, and infrastructure, hotels are being built, and it's full of people coming. A similar situation with Rwanda as well, where post their genocide, you had Kagame who went in there, he had a vision, he took things seriously, he did it his way, just as the Côte d'Ivoire is doing it their way. So it's not about taking the World Bank textbook on how to run an African country and following it blindly. It's much, much more about people who, and whether we like it or not, they're younger than most of the politicians who are much, much older and are refusing to change. But the point is this, is for those economies that are changing, they're doing it much faster than people realize.
I think strong leadership is the key. Whether it's in government or business or what, but you need strong leadership. And I think those two examples, you obviously had that in the head of state. And there are other examples of that around the continent as well. And then driving that through into society by execution of actions. And I think that's a key thing. I think everyone was excited about the change in Nigeria a year ago. And the key was going to be execution of plans, et cetera. And I think that's optimism is always great up front, but then it's got to be followed by strong leadership and strong execution and doing the right policies, et cetera, that happen. And I think that's where you see. And again, it's all you can pick any different country, and they're on a scale of 1 to 10, every different way. So it's basically strong leadership. And when you don't have it, you've got some countries that are in chaos because ours is no strong leader. Central African Republic, some of the, Sierra Leone for a long time, so those are the things I think that are key. Because you have, as you heard earlier, Simon said, is that it's an incredibly diverse area, and there's still a lot of ethnic tensions. Tribal tensions depending on the countries, and that tends to be the political parties, and so that always, Kenya had their problems 8-9 years ago and have come through that. So I think that's a key thing, is the leadership.
Sana, what's your perspective on this?
I would say Africa was isolated before. The modern world has really helped it come out of itself. I think leadership where, about 10 years ago didn't want to change. They weren't transparent. They had no fear. I think today you're seeing a lot of governments now having to be transparent. Leaders are a little bit more concerned of what the repercussions of their bad behavior. So take Kenya for example. Both our leaders went to trial in the ICC. I think it sent a shiver down the spine of all aspiring leadership in Kenya itself, not to go down the same route. regardless of who was guilty or not. I think the fact that there was a lot of global presence and a lot of eyes on the continent actually helps deter some of the bad habits that African leaders are used to.
This is a great, theme, because I'm thinking about the whole question about, governance and the role of sort of international organizations and foreign governments in sort of prodding along some of these countries to making reforms. And do you think really the international community played a very helpful role in the case of Kenya?
They helped. They definitely helped. But again, the textbook style of how to run an economy doesn't really help.
Yeah.
I think it creates a framework for the discussion. But there needs to be flexibility with those organizations to take into account the different backgrounds.
But I think also I hope there's no one from the World Bank here or IFC or IMF, because I'm about to bash them
They're
again, just like I did yesterday. So the unfortunate truth is they do not understand Africa. They simply don't understand it. They've got great economists, they look at the world and from one window and they think this is how things should happen. I've not seen the World Bank define a policy for a small region or a country specifically, because it's so diverse. What you can apply, for example, in Nigeria in terms of policy or help the government, it doesn't apply to Ethiopia, it does not apply to South Africa, it does not apply to the other 54 countries. And this is the debate we were having yesterday, is they draw up policies and they try and force governments. I mean, the IMF said Nigeria's economy is $500 billion over one calculation they did. The truth is, go to Nigeria now and tell me if this is a $500 billion economy. What is the basis for that calculation? It was based on, obviously, oil price, GDP, etc. So do you now reclassify Nigeria at, 200 billion because the oil price is at 30? I mean, they don't take all the other aspects of the economy into this. So the influence they've had has actually been very wrong, because there's a bit of, I wouldn't call it deception, is a very big word, but you tell investors abroad Nigeria is a $500 billion economy. That's fantastic. We're going to go there. We're going to invest. And then they come and they realize currently it's a very different reality to it. So I think the view and that thought process needs to change by these organizations, for sure.
Now, you've mentioned commodities a couple times, and I'm head of commodity strategy, so I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask you about the commodity price collapse, because cynics on Africa would say the Africa Rising story was really a commodity story and about China's appetite for African commodities. And with this price collapse that we're seeing, and now the question is there a structural shift in demand for commodities? What does that do to the Africa Rising story?
I think that story was also Australia's.
Yeah.
And also, all of a sudden, you see the fracking in the U.S. How many companies are now going bankrupt because they borrowed? So I think look, the oil price has been more around $30 to $50 a lot longer than it's been above 100. Mm-hmm. Now it's been above 100. If you from 08 to 14 or 15. That's 7 years. If you look back the last 30, it's been anywhere from 15 to. So this idea that it's $100 oil barrel per oil, or $100 per barrel, is the key thing. But commodity cycles come and go, and so and I think the demographics, the continued growth, especially consumers, the needs of infrastructure, all that's going to be there. And I think the question is China did drive that, no question about it. But on the other hand, Africa will soon drive some of that too, because they're going to need more buildings, they're going to need more power, they're going to need all the other stuff that China was as a developing nation. Now it's going to take time and get there. It's 50 some odd countries versus one, monolithic government that can do what they want. But I think so that commodity cycle, people come around, if you come around and visit now, there's still as much activity going on, building, et cetera, across all the countries pretty much. And are there a couple that are hurting badly? Yes, some are from the oil.
The Nigeria,
but it's not necessarily $30 oil. No. It's because of currency control. It's because of other policies that happen.
But I think also what has actually happened is, we must not forget one thing. Whenever oil is discovered in one of these African countries, all the other industries, agriculture and the likes, collapse. It's been proven. If you look at Nigeria, Nigeria actually was the largest cocoa and palm oil producer in the world at one stage.
Textile
It
industry,
was.
yeah.
And all that industry was ignored because oil was very easy. You know, you sell oil, it's very easy. You get the majors to come and invest. The money somehow trickles down one way or the other to the economy. People are happy, you know, there's a boom, there's buildings going on, etc., and so on. So people were moving into the cities. Look at the growth of Lagos, for example. This is maybe 20 million today. I mean, it's not built for this kind of people population. So, and the same thing in Ghana. I mean, Ghana used to be the largest pineapple producer in the world and exporter. That industry is gone since they discovered oil. It's gone. So the high price of oil at $100 has actually made the problem worse rather than better. It's only shifted the problem forward. And now we're seeing the impact of this. So if oil stays at, say, $40 for the next 5 years, there will be a correction, of course. There'll be more economies that will spring out. There'll be more wealth spread amongst the middle class, which is the middle class we have in Nigeria. We've had about 5 million families that were created in the last 10 years in the middle class sector, which did not exist before.
This idea that oil price is the most important driver of economic development in Africa bothers me a lot. It ignores, and it shouldn't, the other resources that Africa has. So excluding a number of people, just the sheer breadth of resources, the land she has, are things that are coming. Also, it ignores the rate of evolution in innovation, in technology development, and how that's changing life in Africa. 15 years ago, if I wanted to change a meeting, the time of a meeting in Nigeria, I would send a driver who would sit in 3 hours of traffic to go there and tell them that I was running 15 minutes late. Now I send them an SMS.
Yeah.
If I want to buy a specialized thing from a village in northern Nigeria, I send an SMS, I wire the money, or rather, I wire the money by phone, it gets delivered without me moving from my seat. There's a phenomenal amount of change that's happening right across the region that is being masked by this discussion around the oil prices. Of course, the commodity prices are important, but Côte d'Ivoire is also a commodity-rich economy. The difference with Nigeria is Côte d'Ivoire has a diversified economy. She has a basket of 3 different commodities that she relies on for survival, whereas 90% of Nigeria's export revenues come from oil, as do another 7 other African countries, and some of the larger ones as well.
Well, I think the other piece. Oh, sorry. I was going
to. So it's the oil is important, but there's so many other developments that are happening in Nigeria and in other countries that people are missing, and we need to, and the people who are really going to be successful in Nigeria for the long term, beyond 2016, 2017, need to take a look at some of those things.
I think when you look at the imports, the cost, what's happening now is that you've got oil. Take Nigeria as an example. They export all their oil and they import all their fuel.
Right. Yeah.
So what happens is they export the oil, you know, and then they import it, and the currency plays a role in that.
Yeah.
So if they have a refinery locally that they can just take the oil, you know, indigenous oil, and then process it and put it into fuel, all of that extra externalities of impact disappear. In Côte d'Ivoire, you've got, you know, they're the biggest producer of cocoa. You know, why can't they make chocolate and export that? Those are the kind of things that have got to start to happen, because, and they will, and because the populations are still large and growing, et cetera. So I think those are the kind of investments that we'll start to see a lot, that'll drive a lot of the economic value as well. Because right now, too much of the stuff gets imported, and the logistics are awful everywhere. All right, so you know, you've got the Nigeria rail system, which fundamentally probably hauls less than the rail system in Southern California, and you know, it's all trucks, and the roads are terrible. You know, and same thing in Kenya, same thing in many of the countries, and for businesses to do logistics and all that, it really is a problem. And so Kenya has equivalent labor cost to China, but they have a tremendous premium related to logistics, power, all the infrastructure things. So as that changes, you're going to start to see a lot of change as well.
I think the commodity price story is actually a blessing in disguise for Africa. If you actually compare Kenya and Tanzania, Kenya and Nigeria, both shining stars in Africa, Kenya has no commodities, doesn't rely on any oil or anything for its economy, whereas Nigeria does. I think they're now in talks of sharing stories with each other on how Kenya can, export a few of its ideas on how to, build its manufacturing industry and so on, grow its exports. I think the big challenge for the continent is how to make its exports more competitive. We don't have a diversified export base. And I think governments have become very lazy relying on this commodity story. It's built them a lot of goodwill. It's an easy way to grow wealth in an economy. Building SMEs, focusing on them, helping them grow their ideas, incubating is a challenge. Yeah. But it's a harder story. So I think governments really need to now start focusing on alternatives, and they have no choice right now. So it is a blessing in disguise, and I'm in a way glad it's happening.
Before I open it up for questions, I want to get your thoughts on which sectors you think are the most attractive in Africa, and what is the sort of key challenge that you think the various governments are going to need to overcome, or there are going to be different challenges, but which challenges that should be focused on to overcoming to really grow those sectors?
So I think another good thing where Africa is placed right now is we don't have to go through the learning curve. We can just jump straight to the top. We can see what other countries have done well and what hasn't happened and just borrow ideas. I think that's the greatest advantage of where Africa is placed right now. When you just going back to the commodity thing, I think again, I think Jay touched on this. There's enough happening above the ground. We need to stop looking at what's in the ground and exploiting it. And if we do that, I think Africa can also rely on itself. We've got everything we need. We do not need to start exporting our products and then someone else value adding and us getting the raw deal. I think we need to start looking at value addition on the continent itself. We can generate enough revenue and enough wealth to become self-sustainable. So I think there's huge potential. I think the big focus for us right now is healthcare. And again, we've looked at models that have worked around the world and without going through the learning curve, just started to focus on how to create better health systems. It's been huge. There's potentials everywhere. I think just keeping your eyes open.
I think we forget one thing here is actually the biggest resource in Africa is its people. And the people are so resourceful in a way, but unfortunately the opportunity is not being presented to them. And by opportunity I could mean many things. It could also be the education part. And what has happened in a lot of the West African countries, which I can speak for, especially Nigeria, is in the 80s, a lot of families sent their kids abroad to be educated. Most of those guys actually did come back in a way, and they're very tech savvy. And if you look at how many technologies are actually coming out of Africa, is just kind of mind blowing. And we are an African technology company, and we operate in more than 20 countries today from technologies that were invented in Africa by Africans for their markets, and all of a sudden there was a need in other markets for these technologies. So in my opinion, I mean, there's no enough emphasis on fintech and technology in Africa, and more coding schools, teaching the people basically, because you've got a population that's probably going to explode by 2050. So you need to capitalize on these resources. Yeah, the land can feed probably 10 times the population, but how is that going to help them in life? How is it going to help them be exposed to the international community? And I think we've seen the impact of technology just in the last 5 years in Africa. So more energy and focus on this.
My topic would have to be agriculture and development in agriculture, just because of the impact it'll have in terms of employment and what that would do for economic development. Most of agriculture today is still very much non-industrial, so the reach into SMEs as well will be very widespread. We can't talk about Africa's development without thinking about the impact that the technology sector, which Bassem just talked about, it's critical. The more that we harness that, the more we leverage that, the more we use that to do things without having to go through all the lessons that other people have learned before, is again very important, and particularly within that is fintech, because that would really fuel trade within countries and would also fuel intra-regional trade. So we would, and it takes very few countries to do very little very well for us to then have a situation where the intra-regional trade within Africa is fueling its own momentum and growth. In terms of what the governments themselves could do, two very simple things. And again, we talk about the leadership and the state of leadership in Africa. The good news is we don't need rocket science in leadership. We really just need the governments to pick a handful of things that they just decide to drive through and do very well. If we do have our own Lee Huan Yu's, great, but we don't. If we don't, it's still fine, because all they really need to do, and more importantly, is fix energy across the continent. It's a very common problem. Yep. It's a big inhibitor of development, and also strategic infrastructure projects. And the last thing I would say is there's some things that are just simply not fundable by private sector, local or international. We were chatting about some of them earlier. The Nigerian power grid, for example, is a big case in point. There's about 20,000 megawatts of energy hovering around that grid. The grid cannot contain more than 5,000 megawatts of it. No one is going to come and develop that grid unless the Nigerian government, together with DFIs like the World Bank, etc., come together and provide that grid which enables growth.
I would say infrastructure and innovation. I'm glad you said energy as a big power generation company. Happy to hear that. And healthcare down on the other end. Thank you, guys. But I think the innovation piece, we do a thing called the innovation barometer around the globe, and we did Nigeria and South Africa a couple of years or last year. And one of the issues that you have on innovation is the ability, and what we found was, as Bassem said, is part of it's educational, the education piece, but then the other piece is liquidity of markets. How do you get venture capitalists? How do you get an IPO market that's deep enough, or just to even get it started? So if you look at some of the technologies that have been developed, you've got in Kenya, there's a number of different entrepreneurs. I mean, somebody asked me the other day, do you think Africa will have a unicorn? I said, well, there probably is one, but it's called Safaricom because they do all the M-Pesa. So I mean, those are the kind of and that's a tremendous, and it's been around for almost 10 years now. So, so I think that's one key thing. So if and they said, well, are there any innovators that have come out of Africa? I said, well, yeah, there's a guy named Elon Musk. Unfortunately, he's doing it in California, not in South Africa, where he grew up. But that's probably because of the opportunity that's here with capital, technology, et cetera. So that will continue to happen there. As Bassem said, the people are going to be the resources to drive that, and I think that's key. But the other one is I think on infrastructure, and I think what happens in Africa, which is a combination of the political view versus I'll call it the business view, for lack of a better term. But if you look at power, is one. We had a long discussion yesterday about broadband, same thing. You got access and availability. So access is what everybody focuses on. I can't tell you how many places I've been and everyone talks about 600 million people in Africa that don't have access to power. Well, that's important, but availability is more important for economic growth. So when Eskom in South Africa last year did load shedding, the South Africa GDP got hit by a couple of basis point, hit. And that's more important than making sure that we've got all the other people that don't have power have power.
Right.
And I think that balance, but it's not an easy political statement to say. And I think that's the same thing. It's like broadband for every, Mark Zuckerberg wants to give everybody access to the internet, which is great, but at the same point in time, the people that need it, which are businesses that are using it, they need a much stronger capability of the broadband infrastructure. That's where the investment, so those kind of things I think get muddled up in the narrative about Africa, because all of the, it's the NGO, everybody looks at Africa as the poor continent, and they don't look at it as this thriving business hub that needs continued investment around some of the basic infrastructure.
That's fantastic. All right, we already have one hand in the air for questions. So we're going to get mics. Gentleman in the front, and then there we go.
Thank you very much. My name is Ruben Brigady. I'm the Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. I'm also the immediate past U.S. Ambassador to the African Union in Addis Ababa. I have a geopolitical question as it relates to business in Africa. I am convinced that U.S. engagement in Africa, political engagement in Africa, depends on the engagement of U.S. private sector on the continent. And the Chinese, as we know, are heavily engaged across the board. So my question for those of you that are Americans and those of you that are Africans, what will it take to get more American Fortune 500 companies, more American private equity firms, and also more SMEs to recognize that they're beyond the extractive industries, to recognize that there is a serious value proposition and to engage in Africa for the long term?
Yvonne, I'm going to put it to you.
I'm trying to think of a politically correct way to answer this question, because
Yeah, be honest.
The door's closed.
just because, frankly, the U.S. have issues of their own, including just how worried they are about life in their own space. So, looking at Africa's complexity and having the time to understand it and decompose it is the biggest challenge, I think. That said, it is the leading economy of the world, and it needs very few points of engagement. I think that I don't see the US as leading the dialogue for change in Africa. I think the more open-minded economies will do that. However, when the more orderly markets appear, which they will, it's when, and I'm talking about 5-10 years, and the scale is more evident, and we have more stories like MTN, Dangote, GE's success. When people like Jay go back to the US and tell the real stories of what's happening, that's when we'll see the US's engagement. So what does that mean? I wouldn't prioritize. Prioritizing the US engagement with the US is absolutely key. I wouldn't depend on it for Africa's development.
I think it's kind of twofold. It's one is the developed markets look at developing markets a different way than developing markets look at developing markets. So if you do business mostly in the US or Europe, and you're looking at Africa or Latin America or India, anywhere, you see all of the issues. And why you shouldn't, the answer is no until you say yes, rather than yes until you say no. China, Brazil, they look at, and Africa, India, I mean the people that are making the trips now, the government, India, Turks, China, and they bring we followed this around a couple of years ago at the World Economic Forum, and then to Kenya was, the premier of China came in with a 747 full of business people. And they 2 days in Nigeria, 2 days in Kenya, throwing around billions of dollars of potential and stuff. We don't do that. We do it on our own, but we go in and we'll say, well, we want to win a project, a power project, and then we got to cobble together all the financing and how you do it. The Chinese come in into Kenya and they say, well, we're going to build you a standard gauge railroad. We'll give you a $3 billion concessionary loan. Oh, by the way, it's going to be all Chinese material and all Chinese people. So that's a tough way to compete. But, I think it's a combination of people understanding what the risk is, the real risk versus the opportunity. And then I also think that Now, all of a sudden, we couldn't get an American engineering company to come into Africa to work on a power project. All of our EPCs are it's the Greeks, it's the Turks, it's the Indians, it's the Chinese. Now, all of a sudden, Bechtel, the other guys are interested. Why? Because the oil companies aren't building anymore, so I think that's also, you go where opportunity is. And so I think it's a balance of both. But I think look, my view of it is I spend a lot of time advocating for Africa around in the US. And it's not people flying in a couple of days and going back. It's going to be on the ground, investing, doing it that way, and then really driving the change. And the longer that our competitors stay out, the happier I am. But on the other hand, we need other people in there. I'm on President Obama's Council for Doing Business in Africa. We're trying to drum up some of those capabilities, and it's hard to get people to really think through and understand it's a long-term game. It's the commodity cycle. The commodities will go back up, they'll go back down, but you got to be in there for a long term. And we're a big company, and we've got leadership that believes in that, and that's how we've structured it.
Okay, we've got a lot of questions. So what I'm going to do is take a couple together. So these two, the scarf, start with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Aubrey Ruby, co-founder of the Africa Expert Network. I also have a what would it take question. One of the most inspiring things I've seen after doing business in the continent for the last 15 years is the Northern Corridor integration projects that's going forth in East Africa. And through that, the governments of Uganda, Kenya, and Rwanda have reduced transit time from Mombasa to Kigali from 22 days to 5 days. And that's over the course of a 14-month period. And that's with presidents meeting every 2 months for progress reports. And they've done that with zero new investment. So in a time of constricted capital flows, outside of maybe the Chinese, my question is, what would it take for in Nigeria to attack the same kind of inefficiencies in the system that the East Africans are doing right now through NCIP? Because that 22 days to 5 days meant that there were 17 odd days of just inefficiency, trucks sitting there, paper requirements, all those things. So this is Nigeria's opportunity to trim out that fat and find growth through that. And my question is, what would it take for Nigeria to do that? How long does it have to hurt?
I'm going to break the rule. We're going to just take that question, and then we'll go to yours. So what's it going to take for Nigeria? And then
Look,
your view on East
we need to
Africa.
understand the problem before we try and figure out the solution. When you compare East Africa, you have economies that are not very far apart in size from each other. So you can actually agree on how to do things.
But I mean internal to Nigeria, not...
When you're in Nigeria, and Nigeria is that size, and every other country around it is that size, there's no interest from Nigeria to drive such a project, if you like, because they're going to put most of the money, if you like, for any projects, be it a railway, be it roads, be it whatever, and so on. Up till a few years ago, if you needed to fly to Cameroon, I'm talking 3 years ago, it was easier to fly from Lagos to Nairobi or to Amsterdam and back down, because you couldn't get a flight between these, because they could not agree, basically, and there was no investment in aviation. So thirdly, it's not a priority project. It might be for the smaller countries around, but for Nigeria, it's not a...
In Nigeria, for example, getting tomatoes down from Kaduna down to Lagos,
Yes.
it's cheaper than bringing them in from outside than to bring them inside Nigeria.
That's right, because you've got the way the money is split in Nigeria with the government, with the governors and the governments, is they're all interested in their kind of mini pet projects in their region, building a
36
bridge that is used by 4 people every week.
Yeah.
Because it goes to his village. The problem is the money isn't being spent properly. There's no, at least from my experience, I haven't seen, for example, governors that control these budgets sitting down and saying, listen, how can we build all this rail network between us? Why don't we co-finance? None of that happens. So this is again, leadership and political will.
Can I just, there are a couple of things that are happening. I mean, so Lagos State, for example, is doing quite good work, I would say, on looking at alternate means of logistics around and into Lagos. And a key area project that they're working on there is the waterways. And then there's also the red and blue line rails that is getting a lot of It's not getting the right level of publicity, unfortunately, but it's getting a lot of attention. So this government, again, it hasn't communicated it as well as would have been good. But there is a big focus on infrastructure, and that's why they've taken one of our more successful. I think the most successful governor we've had in a long time, Tunde Fashola, and put him in charge of infrastructure for Nigeria. So I do think that there is quite a bit of activity going on as we speak on those key projects. And if they do get implemented over the next 3 to 5 years, we will see a difference in the level of infrastructure. There's also discussion around warehousing, especially in northern Nigeria, to help enhance agriculture. So these are some of the things that are going on at the moment, and this was part of some of the discussions they were having in China in terms of getting the funding for some of these things.
So we'll go next, and then we're going to go to the back after that. So.
Thank you very much. Great panel, I must say. My comment would be about the role of Africa, what the ambassador talked about. I think the advice for the Americans is to move away from rhetorics to action. I think the destiny for Africa really lies largely within Africa. It's no surprise that China has a better appreciation, but what we'll be advising the Americans to do is not to discourage the very actively focused private sector companies in America, like the GE question. For example, it makes no sense if the American rhetoric focuses on all of the reasons why business should not be done in Africa, and then thereby discourage other other private sector companies. The other point, of course, is to say that Africa policy, I think Yvonne talked about it, leadership and policy to create the right environment within Africa is what is required. And then when I listen to what Jay spoke about, what the Chinese are doing, they come in, they talk, they use money, they use people to follow it. Interestingly, America does similar thing, but they don't follow it as much. What you see the American Exim Bank doing in Africa is basically do the rhetorics and follow it with more rhetorics, little or no action. Thank you.
That's great.
I mean, to that point, on the Exim Bank, which we as a company have been very vocal about, they committed $5 billion to Power Africa, and they've spent 130. So now part of that's because they lost their authorization and all that, and they're still going through a lot of that. But OPIC, on the other hand, pledged $1.5 billion, and they've spent $1 billion, $1.6 billion. So that is part of it, but it's a question, and don't get me going on the American political situation, but part of it's that as well from that standpoint.
I do want to just emphasize very quickly that there are private sector companies in the US who are taking long-term views. Bank of America too is one of them, being extremely selective about how we do business in the region, but we are doing business. We are running very good commercial business. We have an office in South Africa. We're opening up in other parts of Africa, and we're investing in the environment. We're investing in talent. So we have an African talent program. There are companies that are doing it, and just to your what would it take question, maybe the government should just support the private companies that do want to come to Africa.
Yeah, I just want to say that, and no disrespect to anyone here, but when America normally comes, I think they come with a huge checklist of conditions that need to be met before they can put their money on the table. China has no checklist. And even if you compare India and China, India's checklist is slightly bigger than China's, so India's not been as successful as China. The other thing is that the Chinese have come in on a long-term stay. They're not coming in to develop one project and leave. They have put a mandate out to infiltrate the economies of Africa. They're mixing in as much as they can because they've seen the advantage the Indians have had over many generations. We have great relationships with multiple people. The Chinese can put a bag of money on the table and get a deal, whereas the Indians over the last 100 years can have a conversation with fellow Africans about the value proposition. So I think America needs to drop this checklist. And just going back to what Jay said, Obama came to Kenya about a year ago. There was lots of glam, but I don't see anything having trickled down to the people. The Chinese premier has come in and it's already $5 billion down. So I think, action speaks louder as well.
We're going to go now to the back. This lady's been waiting very patiently, and then to you, and then back over.
Hi, my name is Susanna Amos, and I'm a student at USC, and I'm from Angola. So I have two questions. One, we speak about the role of government in developing, kind of helping spearhead Africa's development. However, being from Angola and being one of the most difficult places in the world to do business and very high corrupt levels, how do you kind of, I guess, incentivize government to have this long-term futuristic view? And also with the Chinese investments, I guess the lack of checks and balances also increases the opportunity for corruption and for a decrease in transparency, and kind of like the wealth is being condensed at the top rather than trickling it down to the people. And then my other question regards to intellectual property. I'm currently working on developing a project. However, it's the lack of intellectual property protection kind of makes it a barrier to actually going back home and developing these businesses that I'm thinking of. So how do you kind of deal with those two aspects of doing business in Angola?
3 excellent questions. So who would like to start with this?
Should I?
Yes.
I'll just maybe start with government policy. I think our success back home has been really giving governments the ability to get goodwill. So we've given them a lot of political goodwill through the projects we do, which has also assisted them to change policy in the direction that we would like. If you take infrastructure, for example, there's been a lot of change in PPP projects and the way they've been executed over the last 2-3 years in Kenya. But that's primarily been driven by private sector. And the reason that the government's been bought into it is because it's given them a lot of political goodwill with their voters. So they really want to do these projects. It's something that's exciting for them. Going on to the second part of your question in terms of was it the intellectual property? Yeah, it's challenging. It's definitely challenging, but I think you're seeing more markets now developing policy to allow protection of IP. Kenya, for example, does have certain bandwidths to allow that. So,
can I put the third question? Because I thought that's a great question about China. Because when you don't have a checklist, does that lead to greater governance problems at the top? I mean, we've all talked about the role of leadership, and
I definitely agree. It does lead to corruption. But do we wait 20 years for the railway, or do we just get on with it now and close our eyes? So I think you need to weigh out the benefits with the costs. I mean, it's a controversial topic.
No, it's very controversial.
It could be its own session. Could be this topic.
But it's very simple. I mean, when you said China should, the US should drop the checklist or change, I can't remember what the language you used. I thought I was. Let me say what I really mean. The US and actually the international community should modify their checklist, but they should not drop their standards.
No, agreed.
Jay will tell you, I can tell you, because we represent international firms, and I'm sure Samit and Basim are the same. I do business in Africa without availing myself to corrupt practices. Miguel, who's my colleague who works in Citibank, is nodding his head. So it's not about dropping the standards and dumbing down the issues. I don't have a dumbed down compliance model for dealing in Africa.
I
have the same model.
Yvonne, when it's banking or certain sectors and so on, it's quite different than, for example, trying to do a private-public partnership project. I mean, there was instances of projects where I brought a Chinese company wanting to invest $80 million in a fiber network in Lagos, free of charge. They told the government, we're going to do it free of charge for you, but we want your e-governance projects. We're going to have control over that. We want to do all of this for you and so on. After discussions, 4 months ongoing, etc., the commissioner says, yeah, we're going to have to do an RFP. It's an RFP for what? We've come to you with $80 million on the table. You want to get an RFP for what? So, and that process just died because, and obviously we could see that where this was going, and that whole project died because it was heading towards the corruption side, and there was nothing we could do about it. So maybe what to modify what is being said is, rather than come with a solid block checklist, come with a whiteboard and draw what works for you. And if you draw what works for you, and at the end of the day, you assess. If you think, oh, this is too risky for me, you walk out. If you say, well, there is room within these guidelines and so on, then you can continue with your investments and your projects.
Well, I'll just address, I mean, we do business in Angola, and we've been there for quite a while. And it is a tough place. And, but to Yvonne's point, again, we're a big company. I think people understand it. And we do business in a lot of other countries that have issues around corruption. And you have to make sure that your people and your policies and what you do in the company are continually reinforced. And fundamentally, it's okay to say no. I mean, that's the biggest thing, number one. Number two is when you come in and you try to change their process, that's when you open it up yourself to somebody saying, well, why should I change my process? What's in it for me? And I think that's a couple of things. But I also, I also think one of the things, we've had a similar issue, Bassem, like you, which we've invested in building out, some kind of a capability and bringing it to the government and saying, not just in Angola, but elsewhere, and say, look, here's a way we can do it. We'll invest for you. We'll do this. We spend a few $1,000,000 on developing the concept, and then they put it out for an RFP, which is like, well, okay, why, we're not going to do that anymore. So, I mean, that does happen. To your point, it depends on the process. But I think it's starting to get better. It's, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I'm a pragmatic optimist around it, but I think the change is people like you that are going to go back home and make it and want to change and see things changing. And we're seeing that in Kenya, we're seeing that elsewhere. So when you're ready to go back home, I need your business, you need your card.
We
so
have
we'll
time
have a job
literally for one last very quick question, but the speakers will all be around, so I'm all putting you on the hook for this, so you can continue the conversation after this last question.
I think the Rwandan finance minister has been trying to
Oh, no, okay. So we'll make it, all right.
hour, so we need
Okay, we'll get you in there. We'll break the rule on closing time. Sorry, Milken, I may not be coming back, but this is, so very quickly to you and then to our finance minister.
Thanks. Jeff Herbst, CEO of the Museum in Washington. Central drama in many African countries will be trying to provide jobs for the enormous number of young people who will be entering the labor market in the next few years. Would any of the panelists be able to sketch out a model of what sectors are going to absorb the large number of job seekers, and countries are going to have to produce jobs at an unprecedented level globally in order to match the demographic growth?
Okay, job seekers and our finance minister, last question. And then we're cutting off.
Thank you very much. I just didn't intend to speak, but I wanted just to learn from the experts here. My name is Clever Gatete. I'm the Minister of Finance and Economic Planning in Rwanda. And I just wanted to come back to where you started, because in Africa, anything is possible. And you can talk about the details of the businesses, but I think that's not what matters really. What matters is where you started by saying leadership matters. Yeah. And the leadership matters to the ordinary people, it matters to the investors, it matters to the private sector, because they must have confidence in the system for anybody to be able to invest. And we've seen it in Rwanda. The first thing is having the leadership that owns. It doesn't matter who comes in, whether it is a Chinese or anyone, as long as you own it, as long as you can set the standards, anybody will come and fit in if they trust the system. The second thing is inclusiveness. You really cannot do without including the ordinary people who you have to rally behind the vision that you want to go. And they have to see the benefits to believe you. If they don't see the benefits, they don't believe you. Another thing is really openness and also encouraging innovation. Innovation is not just coming from outside. It has to come from inside. And in Rwanda, it has really worked. And finally, what we have also seen is that you are not an island. You cannot really say, I'm going to develop alone. The regional integration, integration part is very, very important, because it becomes the buffer when the times are hard. And of course, you've seen the shocks all the time. That's why the region matters a lot. So really, for me, the leadership is number one, because we've seen it work in Rwanda, where we started from a low base, where the economy had declined in 1994 by 50%, where the inflation was just at the top, 65%. And really there was no infrastructure, there was no system, nothing was working. But to reach where we are now, it is the leadership comes number one because it brings other things to happen. It makes everybody really be hopeful of where the country is going. So I think really where you started was very, very important, and I thank the panelists. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Jeff Herbst, last question. The sector generate the biggest jobs?
Infrastructure. I think infrastructure is the big conversation, and that will definitely deliver a lot of jobs. I am hopeful that with the growth of the export market, that will spur a lot of manufacturing businesses, hence more jobs.
I don't think you can pin it down. The people are so resourceful; they can actually do anything. Agriculture, technology,
it goes on.
Infrastructure. The list goes on. The issue is just again leadership and the will of the people, and giving that opportunity to the people on the ground to actually be able to deliver.
Well, we started on leadership. We will end on
Ends with
leadership.
leadership.
Thank you so much for joining us.